let's get this show on the road. Record screen share. I think I would get a little bit quicker at this with having done this so many times, but I think that's about as quick as it's going to get. Can you see a PowerPoint with a worm on a hook? Need a little thumbs up or something, a head nod. Perfect. Okay, cool. That's great. Then we're sharing our screen. Let's move on. There we go. Thumbs up. Thanks, Thomas. Okay. So here we go. Let's talk worms. This is where we left off. You guys had a few questions about worms the last time we were here. We're going to talk flatworms and roundworms separately. Not surprising to you, flatworms are indeed flat and roundworms are round. They're both bilaterally symmetrical, and you'll see that today, I hope, if we get to planarian, because I do have a couple cool videos about planarian for you. Worms are long, legless animals. They are bilaterally symmetrical. They do have what's called cephalization. Cephalo means head, and cephalization is the formation of a head. And I'm pretty sure that's where we left off last time, or very near to it. I got a couple head nods, so that makes me happy. Okay, so let's see, pen, here we go. Just like with pretty much everything we've talked about, jellyfish and sea anemones and corals, epidermis is skin. Epidermis is skin on you, epidermis is skin on a worm. So hydra, epidermis is the skin. And so worms, of course, do have an outer layer of skin. They actually breathe through their skin, which I'm sure you already knew that. They have no lungs, they have no gills, but all you need is basically a damp membrane where capillaries can interface with oxygen to get that job done. Now, your skin and my skin is way too thick to do that, but for a worm, their skin is so very thin that they can actually just run their capillaries just right to the surface of their body and get oxygen from their environment that way, which is pretty cool. Then they have a mesoderm. You guys have actually already heard the words mesoglia and mesoderm. And so these are both, or no, I'm sorry, I misspoke. You've heard mesoglia and you've heard mesenchyme. Okay, so MES means middle. So whenever you see that, we're talking about a middle layer. So they have a middle layer of muscle, right, which is how the worms are going to move. I'm running off the assumption you guys have all been forced to go fishing at some time when you were a kid, and you tried to put a worm on a hook with a bobber, and it was like wiggling, and it was moving, and you were sad by this, or maybe you were traumatized, or maybe you had, you enjoyed it, I don't know, but you're trying to put him on the hook, but he's like moving around, and you're like, how is he, and they move a lot, right, because there's a lot of muscles. There's muscles that make them long and skinny, and there's muscles that shorten them up, and so they can kind of move all sorts of places with these muscles. And then there's the gastroderm. Again, not a new term for you guys. You already know the gastrodermis from the hydra, which was the skin of the gut, right? And so the gastroderm here is the same thing, the skin of the gut, right? It's all the worm's digestive organs. Unlike the hydra, the worms that we're going to look at do have some different specialized digestive organs. We'll look at the earthworms later because theirs is cool. It's disturbingly like a bird. But for right now, flatworms are a little bit simpler. And our focus is initially going to be on flatworms. So let's take a look at flatworms. Worms are in the order Platyhelminthes. You do not have to memorize that. You don't have to spell it. Don't worry about that. But let's talk about flatworms. Flatworms, no duh, have a flat body. They're not a cylinder like the worms that you guys are used to using when, mom or dad made you go fishing when you were a little kid. They, generally speaking, are going to live, under rocks. They're going to live under leaves of aquatic plants, or sometimes they'll live inside another organism. But they're, generally speaking, not out and exposed to the sun, right? You see worms after it rains or snows, if the snow is melting, because they come out, and then when they get stuck in the parking lot of the school, they never look particularly healthy when they're exposed to the sunlight for a few hours, right? They dry, they become crunchy, that kind of stuff. So what they like is a very moist habitat because they have very moist skin. So in the soil, in the water, under rocks and forest litter, debris, those kinds of things, pine needles and what have you, that's a good place for them to be. The thing about being a worm and having no eyeballs is you're food for everything. Everything eats worms, of course. Robins and moles and all manner of critters eat little worms. And so larger bugs. And so you want to be sure that you can hide, essentially. That's kind of their strategy, is to hide. Not surprising, I suppose. Their body does have 3 layers, which you've already talked about. The epidermis is their skin. The gastrodermis lines their gut, and the mesoderm is essentially their muscles, the muscle layer and a lot of their organs and organ systems that we're going to talk about is their mesoderm. So that's 3 layers you should know, not necessarily just for worms, but because those 3 layers are continuous across so many invertebrates, and we're painting with a broad brush. We're looking at, what do these big body plans look like? How do you get your food? How do you move? How do you reproduce? How do you respond to stimuli? And roll to the next thing, right? And so when we look at these big plans, you have the skin layer, the gut layer, the muscle layers in between. And if you know that, we're going to be in really good shape. So a lot of your critters are going to be kind of organized that way. So if you took a flatworm and cut them in half, which as gross as it is, it's not that gross. We're going to watch a video where they do just that here in a few minutes. What you see is that there's basically a gut cavity. This gastrodermis, right, is this gut cavity, and that's where his food and his waste is in this inside. And then his mesenchyme is the middle layer. Not a terrible amount of muscle necessarily on this flatworm. And then you have a mesoderm where his muscle layer is. And you don't have to label this for a test. Just get the body plan thing down, okay? And then his ectoderm, which I think is such a funny word because it reminds me of, I don't like ectoplasm. Isn't that what those like fake Ghostbuster guys chase down? I don't know. That's what a weird word. But his epidermis, they're calling it ectoderm here, but that's skin essentially there. And these are coelomates, which have true body cavities. And so, or no true body cavities rather. So just a neat cross section for you to get the idea of epidermis, mesoderm, gastroderm. Don't have to label this, but just get the idea of the general body plan. And this silly picture down here will make more sense when you see the video for how a planarian lives and moves and that kind of stuff. So this guy is the name of a very well-studied flatworm. The flatworm is called planarian. You've probably not seen planarian. I have not seen planarian. They're about 1/3 of a centimeter long. So 3 millimeters. So we're talking about, that's really, I mean, there could be a dozen of these things on your pinky nail and you might not hardly know it. So they're incredibly small, generally speaking, freshwater habitats. So almost certainly we've stepped on them, right? But they're primarily eating vegetation and stuff. So they're not really on our radar the way a tick would be or a leech would be. I would assume most of you have seen ticks and leeches because they get our attention a little bit more than a planarian does. So let's talk about planarian. What's his body plan like? How's he move? How's he get his food? That kind of stuff. This is a weird animal. For movement, he moves a lot like a slug or a snail moves. Slugs or snails lay down a layer of slime and they glide on the slime, which doesn't sound like a terribly attractive way of getting around, but it does work. So the ventral side, oh, you probably don't know the words ventral or dorsal, darn it. Do you know, give me a thumbs up if you've already heard the words ventral or dorsal in your life. No. Okay, that's fine. That's what I thought. Thomas Roeder has. Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas. Ventral is front. Okay, so if it's a person, it's your front. If it's a dog or a cow, it's its belly side. Okay, because they're tipped forward, right? Dorsal, like probably dorsal fin on a shark, is your back. And so when we're talking ventral, it's front or belly, and dorsal is back. And so the ventral side is essentially the belly of the worm. They secrete slime and they slide on the slime. Gross way to get around, but it works great. And then they have cilia on that planarian that will kind of creep it along the slime, sort of microscopic cilia that sort of swim it along. They also have muscles, so if they want to, like, I don't know, raise their head, they can just lift the top of their head off the ground like a cobra or something, so that's kind of cool. As far as food, they're going to eat anything. They're kind of like fish and frogs, right? What do fish and frogs eat? Anything that fits in their mouth. That's what they eat, it's all on the table, right? So anything that'll fit in this mouth right here, they're going to eat. Little tiny parts of decaying animals or plant material, sure. If a minnow dies in the lake, planarians will come and suck little tiny, not quite microscopic, but really small chunks of dead fish flesh and eat that stuff, right? Decaying plant material in the forest or the freshwater ecosystem, algae and that kind of stuff, that mouth will work on that algae and kind of suck pieces of algae off of rocks, and they'll ingest that stuff. So that's what they want to eat. If they bump into small protozoans, we're talking about like amoebas and those kinds of things, they'll absolutely eat those too. And so that's what they eat. How do they eat? They have a mouth with a very, very weird way to eat called a pharynx. There is no such thing as a pharynx. A lot of people say pharynx and larynx. There's no such thing. There's a larynx and a pharynx, okay? Now, you have a pharynx, but it's very different. But I'll show you that because that'll help, okay? Where your nose, the air in your nose, when you inhale, comes back here and then goes forward to your trachea. That's this guy right here, okay? Your voice box thing that you can see, that guy, okay? That's called a larynx. Now, the food you eat goes behind the larynx to what's called an esophagus. So you have a really weird intersection where food goes like this and air goes like this, and it's like a crash course of choking, but it works great. And that space between your nose and your mouth and your larynx, the space right there, is called your pharynx, okay? And you know this is the case because you've taken a drink of milk at school or whatever, and your friend has told you a funny joke, and you laugh really hard, and it comes out of where?
Your nose.
Your nose. Yes, unless you're on that America's Got Talent, then you plug your nose and force it out of your eye. These tubes are all connected. Do with it what you will. But yeah, you know this is the case because, you know, you've been congested in your nose. You've been like, and it's like gone in your mouth. And you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do with this? Do I spit it out? This is disgusting, right? The pharynx, as gross as it is, your nose and mouth are connected. Yuck. Called a pharynx. And so why do we talk about this? Because this tube right here between his mouth and his digestive organs is called a pharynx. But his pharynx is about 100 times more disgusting than our pharynx. Pharynxes? Pharynxi? I don't know, whatever. Pharynxi are. And I'm going to show you a video of this guy crawling around and how it eats, and I think you'll really get a kick out of it. So let me see if I can show you this video. Go away, PowerPoint. Discard. Nobody wants to see my sloppy handwriting. Okay, where this guy right here. There we go. That's better. Okay, check this guy out.
Like planaria that we first see bilateral symmetry and cephalization, the localization of the sense organs in the head region. A pair of ocelli, light-sensitive eye spots, are located toward the center of the head. Lobes extending from either side of the head contain chemosensory cells. Planaria feeds using the protrusible muscular pharynx.
Isn't that disgusting? It was like flat with his abdomen, right? But then the muscle like comes out and searches for food to suck into his gut. It is so cool.
The chemosensory cells on the lobes are used to locate the food. Through rhythmic contraction of the muscular pharynx, planaria pumps the food into the gastrovascular cavity with a siphon-like action.
Yuck. Yuck. I don't know what they fed those guys, but that's disgusting. Anyways, since we got videos on, you want to see what happens if you cut their heads off? Me too. It's equally disgusting. My goodness, I have a sponge feeding video at the top of my laptop. What's happening? Those are planarian right there. See him swimming? Look at that. What do you think they feed him? Oh, something gross. That's a planarian with no head. That's sad. See a little clear spot on the top there? The blastema. He like kind of heals over, but instead of making scar tissue, he turns on stem cells and makes a new head. pretty cool. There's his head. See it? Thank you. Thomas Roeder's clapping. That's nice. Thank you, Thomas. Day 13. He regrew a head in 2 weeks. Pretty good. Kind of troubling. And they cut his tail off and he regrows a tail. I don't know if that's worth watching, but if you want to see it, you can. He just looks like he's kind of a short little planarian. It's not nearly as exciting. But he does it. That's a weird looking little planarian. All right. You know, it looks like a planarian regenerates or something. Ooh, pretty crazy, but super cool critter for sure. You cut their head off, they regrow a head. You cut their tail off, they regrow a tail. Pretty cool. And there's some particular tricks that allow them to do this. Not a lot of vertebrates can do this. This guy's an invertebrate, which obviously means he has no spinal cord. But it's still kind of crazy. I don't know if you already knew this or not, but there's this little salamander called an axolotl that has retained its like fetal gills. It's like a little white Mexican salamander, and you can cut their hand off, and instead of growing a scar, they'll regrow a hand, which is pretty cool because they have a spinal cord, you know, and there are a whole lot of vertebrates that can pull a trick like that. So I'm not really sure how exactly it's able to do that, but it's pretty neat. So anyways, here you've got a really great diagram of your planarian, and what a simple body design we kind of have here. He doesn't have true eyes like you and I do, but he has eye spots, and the eye spots just detect light. So it's to our knowledge, it's a pretty simple situation. If they detect light, he knows he's in the light, so he goes to the darkness till they don't detect light anymore, and that keeps him pretty safe. He doesn't have enough of a centralized nervous system for us to really use the word brain. We kind of save the word brain for a little more robust collection of neurons, but he does have more neurons at the front of his body than he does at his tail. So we call this cephalization, and we call this ganglia. So like a bundle of nerves is called a ganglion, and many nerves are called ganglia. And so it's kind of like, it really doesn't justify being called a brain, but let's give him credit and say he has an anterior ganglia. He has big clusters of nerves that are processing this information. And then all the way down his body, he has a gastrovascular cavity. And this is one of the keys to his ability to lose his tail, lose his head, and still be able to regrow. In that, if you look at this, it's sort of like a tree, right? You got this main trunk, only imagine it's hollow, runs all the way down his body. And then you have little branches that come off of that. And so the mouth and the pharynx lead into that gastrovascular cavity. And then the food particles, basically, if you were a food particle getting eaten by a planarian, here you are, okay? You get eaten into the mouth, you go into the gastrovascular cavity, and you flow up, and let's just say you end up here, okay? Then you end up going off into the side, and you're basically digested, okay, in these little side chambers. Then the valuable stuff is going to be taken into the bloodstream, essentially, which is going to be kind of a clear, it's not really blood like you and I have blood, but it's going to get the same job, essentially. Sorry, I have a chat box. This is on the worksheet, right? Yes, Tanner, it is. Great question. And so then you would get digested in here, and then waste particles that are too big to digest. Like, let's say he gets like little chunks of debris from like a stick, right? A twig or something that he can't digest. Then that will actually just work its way back out and be excreted out of the pharynx and out of the mouth. And so it's cool because when you have this really simple structure like this, if you were to cut this worm like this, okay, you cut him off, well, he's still got all this same gastrovascular cavity that he started with. It's just shorter, right, to digest food. He's still got nerve cords to sense his environment. So he's in pretty good shape as far as really simple move around, find food, pull food in, excrete the waste. and you're pretty much there. So they, some pretty straightforward stuff for digesting, getting food, that kind of stuff. And then they have nerve cords. You and I have one big spinal cord, right, that runs down our back. The flatworm has two nerve cords that runs down his ventral side, abdomen, if you like, the front side of him. So that's that. Okay. So, sorry, it takes me a bit to see my PowerPoint because I have your faces and I have a chat box and my screen is I have a busy screen. So some more pretty common sense stuff. Flatworms digest their food in their intestine. No duh. They were just, I hope you know that. So do worms. So do fish. So do birds. So do humans. So do elephants. So do dogs. Like, that's what intestines do. If no one's ever told you, intestines, the long tube of just gigantic, ridiculous amounts of surface area in your abdomen, it digests and absorb nutrition. And it is the same in birds and bats and dogs and cats and elephants. That's what the intestine does. So to see this very, very simple intestine is a great place to start. Their digestible material that they can actually take into their body is going to go into their cells by diffusion. Your digestive system is a lot more complicated than that. But for this little flatworm, diffusion will get the job done. Diffusion, you'll remember from like chapter 3, is just particles moving with a concentration gradient. Very, very simple stuff, right? If you get undigestible material, you need to get rid of that material. Unlike you and I, which enjoy a one-directional digestive system with separate areas for food entering and waste leaving, the poor flatworm has only one orifice for that job. Poor fellow. So he must both eat and defecate through the same hole. So I do not envy him that, poor little feller. And then they have flame cells. Now, flame cells are very different from what you and I have. They're very different from what cats and bats and birds and dogs have. Flame cells are kind of like, you could almost think of them like little baby flatworm kidneys. I don't know. Hopefully there's not a flatworm doctor watching my YouTube video. He'll be like, that's a gross oversimplification. But they're basically special cells that will use cilia to push waste out of the planarian. You and I handle this in very different ways. A flame cell will separate the waste from the good stuff and kick that waste literally out of the side of the planarian. Like his small intestine ends at flame cells, and it'll just kick the waste out and it will go out into his environment. You and I, of course, don't handle our waste that way. The solid waste, of course, continues on through our large intestine until it makes it to the toilet. And the liquid waste is filtered out through our kidneys. We reabsorb all the good stuff, and then we concentrate the not so necessary stuff into urine. And so ours is like way more complicated than this. But it's a cool idea that there are cells in this super teeny tiny flat see-through worm that can kind of kick waste out of the side of his body. Again, not the most glorious thing you've probably ever heard of, but it gets the job done for him, keeps him alive. Here's a kind of weird picture of the excretory system of your flatworm. And so here we have the anterior side, which is his head. Here are his eyes. And so here's his tail. And we have these canals that run very much so in tandem with your intestine. Not your intestine. Whoops, sorry. His intestine. Mitch, are you calculating? His calculator's like covering up his whole face. That's funny. Okay, so he's catching up on math. I don't know. Anyways, and so here we have the excretory system. This is stuff that he was not able to digest. This non-digestible material is cruising along these little tiny canals where it hits a flame cell, and the flame cell will decide that this particle is not going to be any good for food and will actually kick it out of this pore, and now it's out into his environment, just excreted into the pond where he lives. And that's pretty much it. It's a very simple excretory system. There are no kidneys, there are no large intestines, there are no, there's nothing that you might see in a bird or mammals. It's just a very, very simple porous system. And so that's a pretty simple way to do that. The other system we should talk about is his nervous system, right? You and I have a pretty complicated nervous system. That's a That's an understatement. I'm sorry. You and I have an incredibly complicated nervous system, right? You have a brain, and then brain stem, and then spinal cord, and the spinal cord branches into peripheral nerves, and they innervate everything from your fingertips to, your kidney and liver and guts, and it's crazy, right? And so there's a ton of really complicated communication that's going on all the time in your brain, and these guys have a quite a bit simpler system. Their nervous system actually is quite like a ladder. They do have this group of cells at the head. We can't really justify calling it a brain, but certainly a ganglion would be fine. So they have a bundle of nerves at the brain, which is going to basically give them information about their environment. If it's hot, cold, light, dark, that's about it. And then their nerves branch to all of their other sensory organs so they can feel the environment beside them. And so here you have these main nerves running down, and then little nerve branches out to the side, and then little nerve branches like a ladder going across the other side of him. So if he bumps into an object over here, right? Here's my really pointy rock, okay? He bumps into this rock. He can sense that with that nerve. The nerve goes up to the brain. He knows there's an object there. Hopefully it's not a predator. I don't know if he has the common sense to make those decisions or not. I don't know what goes on in the head of a planarian, but he can sense that with his nerves. It goes to the brain, and it's at least transmitted there. These big nerves right here, called longitudinal nerves, are on the length of the body, and the little transverse nerves are essentially the rungs of the ladder. But he has a pretty continuous innervation of his entire body, and he can sense his environment, and he can smell food. And for a flatworm, honestly, if you can find a dark place to stay safe and smell food, you're living. It's nothing to write home about, but that's about it. So we are going to have to stop there and ask for questions because we are just a little bit past 2:30, and I do my very best to be obedient to that half-hour time frame for our class. Does anybody have any questions at all about planarian organ systems that aren't in planarians, what our class looks like tomorrow, or anything like that? Go once, go twice. Donovan.
My question is about heartworms. How do they get into the heart?
Oh, that's such a good question. So like dogs, right? You got to give them drugs for heartworm. That's super tough, Don. I'd have to look it up, off the top of my head. I don't think I could really give you a very confident answer. I hope none of your parents are veterinarians. They'd be very disappointed in me. But essentially my understanding is that, every worm, is specialized to get to a certain place. Like ringworm exists in the skin. Other worms will get into the intestines, and other, parasitic I guess we should say protozoans will go to kidneys or liver, or there's all these different places. And for some reason, heartworms go to the heart. I don't know why it is that they go there, but my assumption would be it's a nutrient-rich place where they can reproduce. But essentially, yeah, the dog, my understanding is that they eat something bad with the heartworm in that product, like another dog's poop or something like that, which when dogs are little, they'll eat almost anything. They're very foolish when they're young. And then they'll ingest that worm, and then he'll travel from, mouth, stomach, bloodstream, heart, land in the heart, reproduce, fill the heart with worms, and then the dog is very ill or dead. So that's a non-veterinarian's understanding of heartworm. So, don't quote me, but that's the best answer I can get you. So don't let your dog eat other dogs' poop. That'd be step one. But little dogs are dumb. I mean, my dog's eating, socks, underwear, washcloths, a light bulb, and a metal umbrella. And she is still alive, which is proof that natural selection doesn't work, because there's no way a critter that stupid should be alive. But that dog will eat anything. And it's not like, well, she's a puppy, she'll grow out of it. Like, she's like 3 years old, and she still vomits up socks. And I'm like, that's a slow learning dog right there. I don't know. I wish I had the answer. I truly do. I'm not a veterinarian. Maybe I'm not even a good dog parent. care provider. I don't know. Why does she eat socks? Whatever. Craigslist dogs, you know, what do you do? All right. So, any other questions? Go once, going twice. Everybody feels really comfortable at how much they know about flatworms?
So
Okay.
we're doing the flatworm sheet tomorrow, right?
Yes, Thomas, that is your class tomorrow. We will not have a Zoom meeting. I'll put it on Edmodo. It's actually already on Edmodo in the folders and has been for a week. Cortland did hers like 7 days ago or something like that. So yeah, you can go in there and do that tonight if you want. You can email it to me, scan it, send a picture, whatever you want to do. And do I need to put my cell number in the chat box? Do you guys know that if you need that? Because you can send me a picture of it if you're like don't have a scanner or something. There's that. Oops. I think I might have just sent that to Tanner instead of everyone. I'm sorry.